مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بدأت الصدمة الأصلية في التلاشي، وبدأ الأميركيون يصارعون الواقع السياسي القائل بأن الرئيس السابق، وهو زعيم الحزب الجمهوري الذي يأمل في العودة إلى البيت الأبيض العام المقبل، قد اتهمته وزارة العدل رسميا بأخطر الجرائم المرتكبة في التاريخ الأميركي، ومن المرجح أن تساك المزيد من الاتهامات قريبا. كل هذا يعني أن دونالد ترامب سيقضي معظم العام المقبل في التنقل بين مجريات حملته الانتخابية إلى كاءات المحاكم. علاوة على كل ذلك، فإن ثم واقع سياسي آخر مذهل، حيث تظهر المؤسسات الإخبارية المحترمة ومنها النيويورك تايمز أن دونالد ترامب وجو بايدن متعادلان بحسب استطلاعات الرأي العام الوطنية فيما يتعلق بالانتخابات 2024. في الواقع وبحسب استطلاعات الرأي، فإن أداء ترامب اليوم هو أفضل مما كان عليه في مثل هذه المرحلة قبل 4 سنوات. كيف يعقل هذا؟ هل يستطيع دونالد ترامب جذب الناخبين حتى وهو يواجه إدى محاكمات ارتكابه جرائم خطرة؟ ما هي استراتيجية جو بايدن للفوز بالولاية الثانية؟ لمناقشة هذه المرحلة الغريبة في تاريخ السياسي الأمريكي، يسعدني أن أرحب باللجنة من الصحفيين البارزين ناومي ليم، أرني ساغز وجايكوب رباشكين. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Joe Biden has had more legislative victories on big issues than almost any first-term president in recent memory. Donald Trump is battling multiple indictments that, if he's found guilty, could send him to jail for decades. Why then are they in a dead heat in national public opinion polls? To discuss this and the current political situation, I'm delighted to welcome Ernie Suggs, Naomi Lim, and Jacob Rabashkin. Thank you all very much for being with me today. So today's basic question is, as I just said, why this dead heat? But first, Naomi, set it up for us. The two heavyweights are astonishingly dead even. What are these polls? What do they say?
So basically, we're looking, even at averages of polls that the president, Joe Biden, as well as the frontrunner in the Republican primary, former President Donald Trump, are dead even. And they've been like this for months now. And this is despite the former president being under indictment, including a second federal one that we saw recently, as well as sort of improving economic indicators, which would technically be in Joe Biden's favor. I think this is setting up next year. I mean, there's also a lot of polling that suggests that voters and the public at large are not excited about a rematch between these two political figures. And I think that it's sort of incumbent upon the Republican primary candidates to sort of maybe make their case. I think there's been a lot of disappointment that, someone like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis hasn't been able to break through, and in fact is his polling support is eroding. And so I think that's sort of this general picture of what we're sort of seeing with this general election that's to take place next year.
So Ernie, let's take a look at the Biden half of this equation first. People tend to like his accomplishments, but not too many people are excited about his candidacy. And at the same time, not too many are buying the notion that because of his son's problems, that he's a corrupt politician. But why is he polling so low?
Well, I think he's had a difficult time getting his message out. Yeah, like you said, legislatively, he is probably one of the best presidents we've had in decades because of what he's done, what he's accomplished, and what he knows, what he understands about politics. He's gotten a lot accomplished, but that has not translated to the everyday person. It is not translated to the pollers. everything that he's done. So, he's, and he's at an advanced age, which Trump is at an advanced age as well. So all of these factors come into play, which may indicate why his poll numbers are so low. But if you kind of look at him on paper, if you looked at it from a 30,000 foot angle, if you look at him on paper, he's doing a fantastic job. It's just a matter of getting the translation. It's kind of lost in translation almost.
Jacob, when you look at some of the details of these pollings, are there particular segments of the Democratic coalition where President Biden is weak?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of trends that we can point to. I think most notably is among younger voters. I mean, these are voters who never really were part of the Biden coalition to begin with, right? In that 2020 Democratic primary, they gravitated toward other candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg. And Biden ultimately was kind of the last option remaining for a lot of those voters in the Democratic Party, many of whom are further to the left than Joe Biden is. And I think we see a continued amount of apathy from those voters when it comes to the president. And that is certainly hurting his approval rating. If we look at the share of Democratic voters who approve of the job that Biden is doing, it is lower than, for instance, the share of Republican voters that approved of the job that Trump was doing when he was president. And so you get kind of a deflated number for the incumbent president, Joe Biden. But what we did see, of course, in that 2022 midterm was there are a significant number of voters who disapprove somewhat, at least, of the job that Joe Biden is doing, that are still willing to go into the ballot box and pull the lever for Democrats. They're not willing to actually cross the aisle and vote for Republicans. So certainly among younger voters, voters of color as well, which were a much more crucial part of the Biden coalition in 2020, there's a tremendous amount of skepticism at the moment. Certainly among Hispanic voters, which was a topic of a lot of conversation in 2020, the president's approval rating is about even. But at this point, it's really incumbent on Republicans, and be it Trump or another candidate, to make the case that they can actually win those voters over. Just because a voter is dissatisfied or not sold on what Biden is doing doesn't mean that voter is going to turn around and vote for a Republican candidate instead.
So, like, Ernie, you're down in a very close state, a purple state, as it were, in Georgia. What does the Biden campaign need to do to excite enough voters to perhaps put that state in the blue column?
Well, I mean, I think that they have, if you're talking specifically about Georgia, Georgia is a state that is definitely trending blue. We have two Democratic senators, Senators Warnock and Ossoff. Stacey Abrams ran a pretty spirited campaign for governor. We have several members of the House of Representatives who are Democrats right here in the heart of Atlanta. So Atlanta and Georgia is a state that is turning blue. Biden and Kamala Harris come down here a lot. They have a very strong coalition down here. So I think Georgia is indicative of a state that is willing to turn, that is ready to turn, and that Biden and Harris, they're speaking the language that people down here want to hear, and they're speaking the language that people down here are kind of willing to accept. We had this huge race between Warnock and Herschel Walker, for example, a couple of years ago, and it was a very tight race. Warnock was a sitting senator coming against this great football player who was a Republican who was supported by Trump, but Warnock was able to prevail because of the message in which he was sending, because of what the Democrats have been saying that they can offer, as opposed to, like as Jacob said, are they willing to, even if they are not fully aligned with Biden, are they willing to vote for a Republican? And I don't think that's the case down here.
Well, let me turn to that issue to Naomi. Naomi, Donald Trump, the more indictments he has, it seems the more committed his base gets. Is it really true that more than 4 out of 10 American voters want to see him again in the White House?
I think that the polling is sort of showing that with each indictment, his support isn't as, he's not getting that bump in the polls that we saw, for example, in March when he was indicted by the New York District Attorney Alvin Bragg. I think with each consecutive indictment, we're seeing less of a bump in the polling as well as less of a bump in the fundraising. And even anecdotally, you know, there was a report this week about, you know, less searches in terms on Google and also even crowd sizes. I think at the same time, we are seeing that Republicans are really sticking with their guy. It's playing into Trump's message of victimhood, politicization of the federal government, particularly the Justice Department and the FBI. And I think that really plays to something that, you know, his supporters like. At the same time, when I speak to voters in Iowa, particularly ones, I mean, these are self-selecting when I go to events for DeSantis or events for Senator from South Carolina, Tim Scott, a lot of them are saying that they are ready to move on. But because I think there's this, you know, stand behind our man kind of mentality, I think that we'll sort of see that continues in polls, and particularly because we're seeing polling that says that they don't think that he did anything wrong. So yeah, I think that that's the case.
And Jacob, when you look at some of the polling details, are there any surprises, groups that are surprisingly open to a second Trump term, Latinos, Asians, et cetera?
I think that you know, at the moment, the people who are anticipating or looking forward to a second Trump term are the people that you would expect, the people that supported him in 2016 and 2020. I think that you know, when it comes to a lot of the kind of the swingier demographics, these are the people who are dissatisfied with all of their options, right? Kind of by their nature as swing voters, they're not going to be first in line to get back to supporting either a Trump or a Biden presidency, regardless of who they cast their ballots for in 2020. You know, I think when it comes to the Republican primary, the important demographic that I've been watching at least is looking at that educational split. We talk a lot about education as a polarizing factor in elections these days, and voters who don't have a college education are much more likely to support Donald Trump in the primary as well as the general election. And for a moment, it looked like a candidate like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis would be able to win voters with a college degree in the Republican primary and perhaps carve himself out a lane among those voters. That's not enough to win a Republican primary. There just aren't enough college-educated voters in the Republican primary electorate to win on their own. But it would have given him a foothold in this race. And what we've seen really over the last couple of months, and certainly since he's officially entered the campaign, is that his standing among those voters has actually slipped, right? He is not gaining with them, he's losing with them. And so now it becomes a question of, do those voters just default back to Trump, many of who many of them supported in 2020? Do they go looking elsewhere for a Tim Scott, for Vivek Ramaswamy or Nikki Haley or someone else in that field that could potentially rise to become the primary challenger to Trump if DeSantis can't make a go of it?
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to look at this question. If these two are stuck at about 42 now, what would it take to get this unstuck before the general election? After the break, in just a moment. Our guests again today include Ernie Suggs. Ernie has reported for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for more than 25 years. A native of Brooklyn, New York, he serves on the board of the Harvard Nieman Fellowship Program. Also joining us is Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. And with us today is Jacob Rabashkin. Jacob is a reporter with Inside Elections, an online platform where he provides analysis of political campaigns at every level of American governance. Prior to joining Inside Elections, he worked at NBC News and for CNN's political unit. All right, Ernie, you've seen a lot of elections in your career. If these two characters are stuck at 42 today, what is likely to get it unstuck so that one can go over the finish line and be our next president?
Well, I mean, Trump first has to win the primary. I mean, that's the first obstacle that which he has to face. I think as these indictments kind of continue to pile on, I think at some point the electorate is going to ask itself, do we want to elect a man president who's facing all these indictments, who may be in jail? Do we want that man in the White House? So I think voters on a real level, not looking at the polls, are going to have to ask themselves that question. Do they want this man representing the free world in the White House again?
Jacob, Naomi suggested earlier that in fact, contrary to Donald Trump's notion that more indictments is good for him, that actually more indictments are raising the skeptical level of people thinking about voting for Donald Trump. What do you think?
So I think that what we saw certainly in that first indictment from the New York District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, was a bump for Trump. He saw a massive surge in fundraising. His poll numbers went up in the Republican primary. And I think that there were a number of reasons why that case in particular was one that provided him some political benefit. But since then, there's been less of a shift in Trump's favor in the numbers. Down in Georgia, it'll be similar to the two Jack Smith indictments. I don't think that it's going to provide him some sort of boost. I think that at the moment, what it's doing is it's keeping him afloat in the primary because it's forcing all of his competitors to rally around him, right? None of his competitors, with the exception of perhaps Chris Christie, have really made any sort of effort to attack Trump or draw any sort of negative attention to the fact that he is sitting on 4 indictments. In fact, they have rushed to his defense and they have made him look stronger and made him look more like the leader of the party. So while it may not be, supercharging his fundraising anymore, it is clearly establishing himself as the #1 guy in the primary. I think to the general electorate, to Ernie's point, it does seem to be taking a bit of a toll on Trump. I think there's a tremendous amount of fatigue among swing voters in particular as they see these charges rack up and just the level of attention that's being paid to him. One thing that we're tracking pretty closely is a slight decline in Trump's overall favorability rating. How many voters see him favorably versus unfavorably. He's always been unpopular, broadly speaking, but right now he's even more unpopular than Joe Biden. And, as these indictments continue, if he begins to, stand trial and perhaps be convicted, are more and more voters, independents, people who are not hardcore Republican partisans, are they going to grow more tired of it? Are they going to begin to want to see somebody else coming out of the party?
So Naomi, you watch the White House very closely. You follow the president. Is the Biden strategy going to be simply let Trump be Trump, and Trump will commit political suicide over the course of the coming months?
I mean, the White House and congressional Democrats at large are sort of really trying to keep the indictments at arm's length. There's this idea that they don't want to add fuel to the fire with all of these sort of weaponization, politicization of these illegal cases. And so I think that that's something that they will continue. It is a little bit more tricky for them, particularly because they are campaigning on this idea that, they're the party of protecting democracy. And so a lot of their criticism over January 6th and the attack that we saw on the Capitol is very closely sort of combined with what the special counsel is investigating. At the same time, we're sort of seeing the White House and congressional Democrats sort of push this idea of the economy. They've really embraced this idea of Bidenomics. And then on the side of that, and additionally to that, also this idea of abortion, we've seen it being, a continual boon for Democrats in terms of particularly why this Republican primary is going on and these candidates being asked about national abortion bans and things like that. And so I think that will see, the White House particularly really amplify those messages going not only the rest of this year, but next year as well.
All right, Naomi Lim, Jacob Rubashkin, and Ernie Suggs, thank you all very much for helping explain our current political situation to viewers on Dachel, Washington. Bye-bye. Around the world, millions of people celebrate the struggle and accomplishment of workers on May 1st. This day was chosen because of a terrible event in the United States. In May 1886, in the city of Chicago, America's second largest city, a demonstration of workers was held to call for an 8-hour workday. A bomb went off at the protest, killing 7 police officers and 4 civilians. The episode made headlines internationally, and the day became an annual occasion for worker protests around the world. But we Americans do not mark Labor Day in the month of May. After that event, a strong movement arose in the United States against organized labor. Over the years, May Day, that is the first day of May, became more associated with the political left, including the international socialist movement. When the United States began to consider creating a national holiday to honor workers, President Grover Cleveland did not want to choose the May date because of its association with the Chicago bombing. Instead, he picked an alternative day in the month of September. The result is that Labor Day in America is the first Monday in September. In my view, whatever day we choose to honor ordinary workers is not enough. I know I live a privileged life in a beautiful home and a safe, secure community with excellent schools, transportation, and hospitals. It shouldn't be this way, but I will admit that it took the COVID pandemic for me to fully appreciate the essential role that ordinary workers play in our lives. I always knew this to be true on some intellectual level, but it really didn't hit home until my life and the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people were turned upside down 3.5 years ago. Like millions of Americans, I shifted from going to the office every day to working at home, talking with my colleagues in Washington and around the world on Zoom. Yes, it was a dramatic change, but I remained safe and secure, if isolated. But that life was only made possible by the millions and millions of American workers and workers around the world who couldn't just shift from the office to their home. Farm workers, people working in packaging and processing plants, people who work in supermarkets, pharmacies, hospitals, postal workers, delivery people, and so many more. Suddenly, it became apparent these people were essential workers, more essential for the functioning of our economy than millions of highly compensated lawyers, professors, accountants, and business people. Far more essential than I was. This Labor Day is the first since our economy fully came back from COVID, and the first since the vast majority of workers have returned to their jobs with consistency and regularity. There are many ways in which our country goes back to normal, back to the way it was before we shut down in March 2020. But one way in which I hope we don't revert to our pre-COVID days is in our recognition of the essential role that these workers play in our lives. They are often extraordinary people doing ordinary things, and for that, we should be forever grateful. To them, I say, Happy Labor Day. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة حول تأثير مشكلات دونالد ترامب القانونية على الحملة الانتخابية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.